The August sun blazed overhead like a merciless eye, its heat radiating from the baked earth of Copper Ridge, Arizona territory, in waves that made the distant mountains shimmer like mirages. The year was 1887, 3 years after the last of the Apache Wars had ended, and the frontier town bore all the scars of a settlement built on violence and desperation. Wooden buildings lined the main street like crooked teeth, their paint peeling under the relentless assault of desert wind and sand. Through this furnace of civilization stumbled a ghost of a child. Elsie Morrison, 8 years old and hollow as a dried gourd, dragged a torn burlap sack behind her small frame. Each step sent up puffs of dust that clung to her already filthy calico dress, a garment that had once been yellow, but now resembled the color of old bones. Her bare feet, cut and blistered from the scorching ground, left tiny spots of blood in the dirt as she made her way down the boardwalk. The sack contained her daily harvest of desperation, broken bottle fragments that caught the light like cruel gems, bent nails pulled from discarded lumber scraps of moldy bread from behind the hotel kitchen, and anything else that might earn her a penny from those desperate enough to buy garbage. Her small hands, wrapped in strips of dirty cloth, bled through the makeshift bandages where the glass had cut too deep. Fresh tears carved clean channels through the grime on her sunken cheeks, and her breathing came in short, painful gasps. The infection in her wounds had begun to spread, sending red tendrils of fever up her thin arms. She paused beside a horse trough, desperate for water. But the bay gelding tied nearby snorted and shied away from her scent of sickness and unwashed misery. Most of Copper Ridge's citizens had learned to look through Elsie Morrison as if she were made of desert air. The banker adjusted his pocket watch and stepped around her without acknowledgement. The preacher's wife gathered her skirts and crossed to the opposite side of the street. A group of miners, fresh from their claims, laughed loudly about their latest silver strike, their voices drowning out the child's quiet whimpering. Only one man truly saw her. Tasunke stood motionless in the shade cast by McGillicuddy's general store, his dark eyes following every painful step the child took. At 28, the Lakota warrior possessed the lean, weathered build of a man who had survived on the harsh edges of two worlds. His black hair hung in a simple braid down his back, adorned with nothing that might mark him as a threat to the suspicious white settlers. He wore practical buckskin trousers and a cotton work shirt, clothes that spoke of honest trading rather than warfare. But his hands told a different story. Calloused from years of handling weapons and working with rawhide, they bore the small scars that came from a lifetime of survival on the frontier. His moccasins, crafted from soft deer hide and beaded with the subtle patterns of his people, made no sound against the wooden planks as he shifted his weight. Watching Elsie struggle with her burden of refuse awakened something deep in Tasunke's chest, a pain he had tried to bury beneath years of stoic endurance. She could have been Wikapi, his younger sister, who had possessed the same pale hair and stubborn spirit before the soldiers came. The memory rose unbidden, an 8-year-old girl's voice calling his name as uniformed men dragged her toward the reservation cattle cars, her small hands reaching through the wooden slats until distance swallowed her forever. The sound of spilling glass snapped him back to the present. Elsie had stumbled, her strength finally giving out, and her precious collection scattered across the dusty street. She fell to her knees with a cry of despair, scrambling to gather the fragments before they were lost or stolen. Blood from her reopened wounds spotted the ground as she worked. Not one person stopped to help. Tasunke's jaw tightened as he observed the casual cruelty of indifference. He had come to Copper Ridge with 3 other Lakota traders seeking to exchange buffalo hides and beadwork for the winter supplies his small band would need. Their camp lay hidden in an arroyo, 2 miles outside town, concealed from the hostile eyes of settlers who viewed any Indian presence as a potential threat. The trading had gone well enough. Ezra Milliken, the town blacksmith, dealt fairly with native traders, unlike many whites who tried to cheat those they saw as savages. But the sight of this suffering child stirred memories and emotions that made profitable business seem suddenly trivial. As Elsie struggled to her feet with her partially refilled sack, Tasunke made a decision that would change both their lives forever. The Morrison family had not always known poverty and desperation. 4 years earlier, Thomas and Mary Morrison had been respectable farmers from Ohio, traveling west with their only daughter in search of fertile land and new opportunities. They had joined a wagon train in Independence, Missouri, carrying their life savings and dreams of California gold. The Sonoran Desert had crushed those dreams with casual brutality. A flash flood born from thunderstorms 50 miles away had swept through a seemingly dry riverbed just as their wagon was crossing. Thomas had managed to throw Elsie to safety on the bank before the roiling water claimed him and his wife, along with their oxen and every possession they owned. The other families in the train, already struggling with their own survival, had pooled together enough money to bury the Morrisons and ensure their daughter wouldn't starve immediately. When the train reached Copper Ridge, they had approached the most prominent citizen in town with their problem. Cyrus Brogan presented himself as a pillar of the community, a successful businessman who owned the largest boarding house delivery stable and held mortgages on half the commercial buildings along Main Street. At 55, he maintained the appearance of respectability, with carefully groomed whiskers, pressed white shirts, and a gold watch chain that proclaimed his prosperity to anyone who cared to notice. "Of course I'll take the child," he had told the wagon train leader with a show of Christian charity. "A man of means has a responsibility to care for those less fortunate. She'll have food, shelter, and honest work to build her character." The travelers had departed feeling they had done their Christian duty, never imagining the hell they had consigned a grieving 8-year-old to endure. Brogan's method was brutally simple. Identify the desperate, offer them hope, then exploit them until they broke or died. The boarding house served as his headquarters for this enterprise, housing a rotating collection of debtors, drifters, and displaced persons who worked off their obligations through unpaid labor. Most never managed to reduce their debts. Brogan's bookkeeping ensured that room board and incidental expenses always exceeded what they could possibly earn. Elsie represented the perfect victim, a child with no family to protect her, no legal standing to complain, and no means of escape. He forced her to scour the town daily for anything of value, selling metal scraps to the blacksmith cloth remnants, to desperate settlers, and edible garbage to the pigs behind his establishment. If she returned with less than 50 cents worth of findings, his leather belt would remind her of the consequences of laziness. His son Calvin, 19, and possessed of his father's cruel nature without the restraining influence of public reputation, served as enforcer for the family enterprise. Where Brogan calculated his cruelty for maximum profit, Calvin simply enjoyed the power he held over the helpless. He took particular satisfaction in intimidating anyone who might show sympathy for his father's charity cases. The Brogan family's hatred extended far beyond mere economic exploitation. They harbored the deep, festering racism common to frontier settlements, viewing Native Americans as subhuman threats to white civilization. Calvin had grown to adulthood on stories of Indian raids and savage atrocities, his mind poisoned against anyone with dark skin and traditional dress. Such prejudice was not uncommon in Copper Ridge. Most of the town's 800 residents had come west to escape poverty or persecution in the east, only to find themselves struggling for survival in an unforgiving landscape. It became easy to blame their hardships on outsiders, Mexicans, Indians, Chinese workers, anyone who looked different or followed unfamiliar customs. But not everyone in Copper Ridge shared these sentiments. Ezra Milliken had learned to judge men by their actions rather than their appearance. At 62, the blacksmith had dealt with traders of every background and nationality, finding that honesty and fairness transcended the color of a man's skin or the language he spoke. In particular, he had developed a grudging respect for the small band of Lakota who visited town several times each year, always dealing fairly and never causing trouble. The old blacksmith had his own reasons to despise Cyrus Brogan, reasons that went far deeper than philosophical differences about racial tolerance. 5 years earlier, Brogan had approached Ezra's son Benjamin with an offer to finance expansion of the blacksmith business. The terms had seemed reasonable at first, a modest interest rate, flexible payment schedule, and Brogan's assurance that he simply wanted to help a young entrepreneur succeed. The reality had proved far different. Brogan's contract contained hidden clauses that made the debt impossible to repay, while additional fees and penalties accumulated daily. When Benjamin tried to protest publicly, claiming he had been cheated, Brogan had beaten him to death in the street with a crowbar, then claimed self-defense against an armed and dangerous debtor. Sheriff Daniel Prater, firmly in Brogan's pocket through a combination of bribes and shared profits, had ruled the killing justified. Ezra had been forced to watch his son's murderer walk free, knowing that any attempt at revenge would result in his own death and leave no one to remember Benjamin's true story. The old blacksmith kept his hatred carefully hidden behind a facade of professional courtesy. But he observed everything that happened in Copper Ridge with the patient attention of a man planning for justice, delayed but not forgotten. He had noticed, for instance, how Tasunke always paid fair prices without argument, treated everyone with quiet respect, and never caused any disturbance during his visits to town. More importantly, Ezra had begun to document Brogan's crimes in careful detail, hoping that someday the right opportunity would arise to see justice done. The confrontation began as Elsie approached the boarding house with her day's meager collection, her small body swaying with exhaustion and fever. The late afternoon heat had reached its daily peak, and the child's infected wounds throbbed with each heartbeat. Her burlap sack contained perhaps 20 cents worth of salvage, a few bent nails, a cracked ceramic mug, and some metal scraps too corroded to be worth much to anyone. She knew it wasn't enough. It was never enough. Cyrus Brogan emerged from his establishment. As she reached the front steps, his pale blue eyes immediately fixing on the half-empty sack. He wore his usual uniform of respectability, pressed white shirt, dark vest, gold watch chain. But his soft hands and calculating expression revealed the predator beneath the civilized veneer. "Well, well," he said in a voice like oil over broken glass. "Let's see what my little scavenger has brought home today." He snatched the sack from her trembling fingers with practiced efficiency, dumping the contents onto the wooden porch where they clinked and scattered. His examination of each item was theatrical, designed to build anticipation among the small crowd of onlookers who had begun to gather for the daily entertainment. "A broken cup," he announced, holding up the ceramic fragment. "Perhaps worth 2 cents to someone desperate enough." He tossed it aside dismissively. "Some bent nails, another 3 cents if McGillicuddy is feeling charitable." The nails joined the cup in the growing pile of rejected items. Elsie watched in growing horror as her day's work was reduced to its pathetic monetary value. Her stomach cramped with hunger she hadn't eaten since the previous evening, and then only scraps of bread too stale for Brogan's paying customers. Altogether, Brogan concluded with mock solemnity, "Perhaps 18 cents. 18 cents for a full day's work." His voice began to rise, and the watching crowd pressed closer, sensing the coming violence. "Do you know how much it costs to feed you, clothe you, and keep a roof over your worthless head? Do you have any idea how much burden you place on a Christian household?" "Please, Mr. Brogan," Elsie whispered, backing away from his advancing form. "I looked everywhere. There just wasn't much today. Maybe tomorrow." The slap came without warning, Brogan's open palm striking her face with enough force to spin her around and send her sprawling into the dust of the street. The sharp crack echoed off the surrounding buildings like a gunshot, and several onlookers actually applauded the display. Elsie lay where she had fallen, too stunned to cry, blood from her split lip mixing with the dirt beneath her cheek. Through ringing ears, she heard Brogan's voice growing louder as he worked the crowd into further excitement. "Lazy," he shouted, raising his hand for another blow. "Ungrateful, I take you in out of Christian charity, and this is how you repay my kindness. Maybe a sound beating will teach you the value of honest work." The watching citizens of Copper Ridge murmured their approval. Several offered suggestions for additional punishment, their voices carrying the cruel enthusiasm of people whose own hard lives made them eager to witness someone else's suffering. That was when the shadow fell across the scene. Tasunke had approached through the crowd with the silent grace of a hunter, his moccasined feet making no sound on the wooden planks. He reached Brogan just as the man's hand began its descent toward Elsie's prone form, his own fingers closing around the white man's wrist with iron strength. "She is only a child," the Lakota warrior said clearly, his accented English carrying to every person in the suddenly silent street. "This is not justice. This is the act of a coward." The confrontation that followed would be remembered in Copper Ridge for years to come, though the truth of what happened would be buried beneath layers of lies and racial hatred. Brogan's face flushed red as blood, his pale eyes bulging with rage and humiliation. No one, certainly no Indian, had ever dared lay hands on him in public. The very foundations of the social order he had built his fortune upon were being challenged by this dark-skinned savage in his plain clothes and foreign braids. "Take your filthy hands off me," Brogan snarled, spittle flying from his lips. "You got no right to interfere with white folks' business. That girl belongs to me legal and proper, and I'll discipline her as I see fit." Tasunke maintained his gentle but unbreakable grip on the man's wrist, preventing the blow without causing injury. "I have seen how you discipline her," he replied calmly. "It is not discipline. It is cruelty for its own sake." The crowd began to press closer hands, moving toward the guns that nearly every man carried in this lawless territory. Racial tensions in frontier towns could explode into violence with terrifying speed, and Tasunke knew he was balancing on the edge of a precipice. "Someone get the sheriff." Calvin Brogan's voice cut through the growing murmur of the crowd as he appeared in the boarding house doorway. At 19, he possessed his father's cruel nature, magnified by youth and inexperience, lacking even the older man's pretense of civilization. "This savage is assaulting my I mean no harm to anyone," Tasunke said loudly, addressing the entire crowd while maintaining his hold on Brogan's wrist. "But I cannot watch a grown man beat a hungry child. This is not the way of honorable people." His words had the opposite effect of what he intended. Several men in the crowd took them as an insult to their own honor, implying that they were cowards for allowing the beating to continue. Angry voices began to rise, calling for immediate justice against the uppity redskin who dared to lecture white men about morality. Through it all, Elsie remained in the dust, watching the confrontation with wide, fever-bright eyes. In her short life, no one had ever stood up for her. Not the wagon train families who had passed her off to Brogan, not the townspeople who witnessed her daily abuse, not even the other residents of the boarding house who suffered under similar circumstances. Now this stranger, this man her tormentor would surely call her enemy, had risked his own safety to protect her. The realization struck her like a physical blow, and tears began to flow down her dirt-streaked cheeks for reasons that had nothing to do with physical pain. Sheriff Daniel Prater arrived at the scene with the studied casualness of a man who had been expecting trouble. At 45, he possessed the soft build of someone who ruled through corruption rather than courage, his badge serving more as a business license than a symbol of justice. His partnership with Cyrus Brogan was both profitable and simple. Brogan provided information about travelers' wealth and paid handsomely for official blindness to various illegal enterprises. "What's all this commotion?" Prater demanded as he pushed through the crowd, his hand resting meaningfully on the butt of his Colt revolver. His eyes had already fixed on Tasunke with predatory interest, recognizing an opportunity to demonstrate his authority while earning Brogan's continued gratitude. "Sheriff, thank God you're here," Brogan gasped, working to regain his composure now that official help had arrived. "This Indian attacked me, grabbed me when I was trying to discipline my ward, threatened me in front of all these witnesses." Tasunke released the man's wrist and stepped back, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "I prevented him from striking an injured child. Nothing more. I don't recall asking for your version of events, boy." Prater sneered, using the deliberately insulting term that reduced grown Native American men to the status of children. He turned to address the crowd with theatrical authority. Did anyone else witness this assault on Mr. Brogan? The citizens of Copper Ridge, who had watched the entire encounter, suddenly found their boots extremely interesting. A few muttered vague confirmations of Brogan's lies, but most simply remained silent. Taking sides in such confrontations carried risks, and most frontier settlers had learned that survival often depended on avoiding unnecessary conflicts. Pete Morrison, the town gunsmith, and a man who shared his surname with Elsie purely by coincidence, spoke up from the back of the crowd. "Saw the whole thing, Sheriff. That redskin definitely laid hands on Mr. Brogan without provocation. Probably planning to scalp him right here in broad daylight." Several other voices chimed in with supporting claims, each more exaggerated than the last. Within minutes, the simple act of preventing a child's beating had been transformed into an unprovoked assault by a savage intent on murdering respectable white citizens. "Seems clear enough to me," Prater announced with satisfaction. "Indian assault on a respected businessman. That's serious jail time, assuming you make it to trial." His meaning was unmistakable. Native Americans who entered his custody often failed to survive the experience. But before he could move to arrest Tasunke, Elsie's weak voice cut through the tension like a knife through canvas. "He didn't hurt nobody." She cried from where she still lay in the dust, struggling to push herself up on trembling arms. "He was helping me. Mr. Brogan was going to hit me again, and this man stopped him." The crowd fell silent at her words, not because they were moved by her defense of Tasunke, but because they were shocked that the beaten child dared to contradict the official version of events. Brogan's face darkened further, his embarrassment now compounded by public defiance from his supposed property. "Get inside, girl, right now, and don't you dare speak unless you're spoken to." Elsie managed to struggle to her feet, swaying with weakness and fever. Blood from her split lip had dried on her chin, and the infections in her hands had begun to streak her forearms with angry red lines. But despite her physical frailty, something in her voice carried absolute conviction as she looked directly at Tasunke. "Please," she whispered just loudly enough for him to hear. "Please don't leave me alone with him." The words hit Tasunke like a physical blow to the chest. They were almost exactly what his sister Wikapi had said the night the soldiers came to their winter camp, when he had been forced to watch helplessly as uniformed men dragged her toward the cattle cars that would carry her to death on a distant reservation. Sheriff Prater stepped closer to Tasunke, lowering his voice to a menacing whisper that wouldn't carry to the watching crowd. "You got exactly 10 seconds to start walking toward your horse Redskin. After that, this crowd might decide you need a more permanent lesson in frontier justice." The threat was real. Tasunke could see several men in the crowd, fingering their weapons, their faces reflecting the casual cruelty that frontier life bred in those who survived its harsh demands. One word from the sheriff, and they would gladly participate in a lynching, then go home to their families with clear consciences and stories of defending civilization from savagery. But he could also see Elsie watching him with desperate hope, this broken child who had probably never experienced a moment of genuine kindness in her short life. The choice before him was simple and terrible: save his own life by abandoning her, or risk everything for a stranger's suffering daughter. Tasunke took one long look at the girl's pleading face, memorizing every detail of her hollow cheeks and fever-bright eyes. Then he turned and walked away, his spine straight, despite the jeers and curses that followed him down the street. The crowd began to disperse, satisfied that the natural order had been restored. Sheriff Prater holstered his weapon and accepted the congratulations of several citizens for handling the situation without bloodshed. Cyrus Brogan straightened his vest and smoothed his hair, working to regain his dignity after the public humiliation. But Tasunke did not mount his horse and ride out of town as ordered. Instead, He circled around to the alley behind the boarding house where he positioned himself to observe Brogan's next actions. The warrior's instincts, honed by years of survival on the frontier, told him that the worst was yet to come for the child who had dared to defend him. Those instincts proved correct. Brogan grabbed Elsie by the arm with bruising force, hauling her around to the back of his establishment, where a small wooden shed stood among the outbuildings. The structure was perhaps 8 feet square, built from rough-hewn planks, with gaps wide enough for air but too narrow for escape. "You embarrassed me," he hissed as he shoved her through the single doorway. "Contradicted me in front of the whole town, defended that savage against your own Christian benefactor. Maybe a night alone in the dark will teach you proper gratitude." The door slammed shut, followed by the scrape of a wooden bar being wedged against it from the outside. Inside the shed, Elsie collapsed onto the dirt floor, her small body finally surrendering to the fever that had been building all day. Through the thin walls, Tasunke heard her quiet weeping. Not the loud sobs of a child throwing a tantrum, but the hopeless, exhausted crying of someone who had reached the absolute limit of their endurance. The sound carried a terrible finality, as if she were already mourning her own approaching death. "I will return," he whispered through a gap in the planks, not knowing if she could hear him over her own tears. "Hold on, little sister. Help is coming." Thunder rumbled ominously in the distance as storm clouds began to gather on the horizon. But this time, the weather would serve a very different purpose than providing cover for rescue. Night fell over Copper Ridge, with the swift finality of a closing coffin lid, bringing with it the first signs of the storm that had been building all day. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of distant rain and the electric tension that preceded desert thunderstorms. Lightning flickered on the horizon, still miles away, but approaching with inexorable purpose. Tasunke made his way back to his people's camp in the hidden arroyo, his mind working through the impossible situation he faced. 3 other Lakota warriors waited for him around their carefully concealed fire, Mahpia, his cousin and closest friend. Tasunke, an older man, whose calm wisdom had guided their small band since the exile. And young Wanbli, barely 18, but already skilled in the ways of survival that reservation life had forced upon them. "You were gone long," Mahpia observed as Tasunke settled beside the fire. The trading did not take so much time before. Tasunke stared into the flames, seeing Elsie's terrified face in the dancing light. "There is a child in the town. A white child, but she suffers as our people have suffered. The man who owns her beats her, starves her, treats her as less than human." Tasunke nodded slowly. "We have seen such things before. The whites' cruelty extends even to their own young when there is profit to be made. But what can we do to interfere further would bring the soldiers and our people need us to survive. The child defended me today." Tasunke continued, his voice heavy with emotion. "When the sheriff would have arrested me for stopping her beating, she spoke the truth despite knowing it would bring her punishment. She showed more courage than all the grown men who watched in silence." Young Wanbli shifted uncomfortably in the firelight. "My uncle, we all mourn for Wickapi still. But we cannot save every suffering child we encounter. The world is full of pain we cannot heal." "Perhaps not," Tasunke agreed. "But this pain is before us now, and we have the power to act. If we do nothing, she will die in that shed slowly from fever and infection. I have seen it before." The conversation was interrupted by approaching hoofbeats. All 4 warriors melted into the shadows, instantly hands, moving to weapons with practiced silence. But the rider who appeared in their firelight was not a threat. It was Ezra Milliken, the town blacksmith, his weathered face grim with purpose. "Peace," the old man called out, raising his empty hands. "I come with information you need to hear." Tasunke emerged from concealment, his expression wary. "What brings you to our camp, blacksmith? It is dangerous for you to be seen with us after today's troubles." Ezra dismounted slowly, his 62-year-old bones protesting the hard ride. Dangerous for all of us, son. But some things are more important than safety. He pulled a leather satchel from his saddlebags and opened it carefully. I've been documenting Cyrus Brogan's crimes for 5 years now, waiting for the right moment to see justice done. Today convinced me that moment has come. From the satchel, he withdrew a thick bundle of papers, letters, contracts, witness statements, all meticulously organized and preserved. This contains evidence of murder, fraud, kidnapping, and worse. Brogan killed my son Benjamin over a rigged debt, then had the sheriff cover it up. He's done the same to dozens of others, Native Americans, Mexicans, anyone he figured the law wouldn't protect. Tasunke accepted the bundle with reverent care, recognizing its significance, even though he could not read the English words. Why do you show us this now? Ezra's eyes found Tasunke in the firelight. Because I heard what that little girl said today, how she stood up for you when everyone else stayed silent. And I know what's going to happen to her tomorrow. The warriors exchanged glances, recognizing the tone of a man delivering a death sentence. There's a trader comes through town every few months. Ezra continued. Man named Josiah Weeks. He buys children from folks like Brogan. No questions asked, and then takes them out into the territories where they disappear forever. Mining camps, brothels, worse places than you can imagine. Tasunke felt ice form in his stomach despite the warm night air. When his wagon train arrived just before sunset, I heard Brogan making arrangements, $50 for the girl to be delivered first thing in the morning. By noon tomorrow, she'll be gone forever. The implications struck all 4 warriors simultaneously. They had perhaps 6 hours to act before Elsie vanished into a fate that made her current suffering look merciful by comparison. There's more, Ezra said quietly. Something I discovered just today, hidden in some old territorial surveys that came through my shop for repairs. He pulled out another set of documents, says these ones bearing official government seals. Your people weren't driven from your hunting grounds because of legitimate land claims. The surveys used to justify your removal were forgeries, criminal conspiracy, reaching all the way to the territorial capital. The revelation hit the warriors like a physical blow. Their exile, their suffering. The deaths of their loved ones on the barren reservation, all of it had been orchestrated by criminals seeking to steal valuable land for mining interests. Tasunke's hands trembled as he accepted the surveys, seeing his sister's death in the fraudulent signatures and forged boundaries. Who else knows of this? Just me, and now you. The real surveys are hidden in my forge along with correspondence that proves the conspiracy. But I'm an old man, and Brogan has powerful friends. If something happens to me before we can get this evidence to honest authorities. He let the sentence hang unfinished, but its meaning was clear. The chance for justice for both Elsie and the Lakota people might disappear along with the only witness to decades of systematic crime. Young Wanblee spoke up from across the fire. We should take the girl and leave tonight. Ride hard for the territorial capital, present this evidence to the government directly. The government that forged these documents in the first place, Tasunke asked pointedly. We need someone with authority, but no connection to the conspiracy. Someone whose reputation for fairness is known throughout the territory. Ezra nodded approvingly. Judge Millard Harrison. He's holding court in Tucson next week. Completely honest man, can't be bought or intimidated. If we can get there with both the girl and the evidence, then we rescue her tonight. Tasunke stated with finality. Before Weeks can take her, before Brogan can silence us permanently. But even as he spoke the words, the sound of approaching horses reached their ears. Many horses moving fast and with purpose. Sheriff Prater's voice cut through the night air like a blade. Surround the camp, don't let any of them escape. The posse that surrounded their camp consisted of 8 heavily armed men, their faces painted with torchlight and hatred. Sheriff Prater sat his horse at the edge of the firelight, his badge glinting as he surveyed the scene with cold satisfaction. "Well, well." He drawled, his hand resting on his gun butt. "Having yourself a little war council, are you planning more attacks on decent white folks?" Ezra stepped forward, his weathered face set in lines of determination. "Sheriff, these men have done nothing wrong. I came here of my own free will to conduct legitimate business." Prater's smile was as cold as winter wind. "That's so, Ezra. What kind of business would an honest blacksmith have with a bunch of savages, unless maybe you're not as honest as folks think?" The threat in his words was unmistakable. In frontier justice, association with Indians was often considered evidence of treasonous intent, punishable by imprisonment or worse. But Ezra had lived with fear for 5 years, ever since watching his son's murderer walk free. Tonight, something in him had finally broken free from that paralyzing terror. The kind of business that exposes murderers and thieves. He said clearly, his voice carrying to every member of the posse. The kind that brings justice to men who think their badges make them above the law. Several of the mounted men shifted uncomfortably at his words, recognizing the implication that their sheriff might not be the heroic figure he pretended to be. But others simply gripped their weapons tighter, eager for the violence they had been promised. Prater's face darkened. "That sounds an awful lot like sedition, old man. Maybe you've been out in the sun too long, got your brain addled by Indian lies." That was when Calvin Brogan emerged from the shadows behind the camp, his young face twisted with malicious glee. In his hand, he carried a long-barreled rifle, its muzzle trained on Ezra's back. "Oh, found something interesting in the blacksmith's saddlebags," he announced, pulling out several sheets of paper with theatrical flourish. "Looks like maps of town buildings, guard schedules, real detailed planning for some kind of raid." Tasunke recognized the papers immediately. They were legitimate surveys and business documents. But in the flickering torchlight and with Calvin's creative interpretation, they could easily be mistaken for something sinister. "That's evidence of Brogan's crimes," Ezra protested, turning toward Calvin with desperate urgency. "Those papers prove..." The rifle shot cracked like thunder, echoing off the canyon walls and sending nightbirds screaming from their roosts. Ezra staggered forward 2 steps, then collapsed face first into the dust, blood spreading in a dark pool beneath his still form. "Self-defense," Calvin announced calmly, working the rifle's lever to chamber another round. "Old fool drew on me when I found his war plans. Had to protect myself." The lie was so blatant that even some of the posse members looked uncomfortable, but Sheriff Prater accepted it with theatrical relief. "Good work, boy. Saved us all from a midnight massacre." He turned his attention back to the 4 Lakota warriors who had remained motionless throughout the confrontation. "Now then, which one of you savages wants to explain what you were planning to do with those maps?" Tasunke knelt beside Ezra's body, checking desperately for signs of life, despite knowing the wound was mortal. With his last breath, the old blacksmith whispered words that only the warrior could hear. "The forge. Everything's hidden in the forge. Get the girl, make it matter." Then Ezra Milliken died, taking with him 5 years of carefully gathered evidence, and the only witness to decades of systematic corruption. "On your feet, Redskin." Prater barked, his patience finally exhausted. Time to face justice for conspiracy and planned assault on white citizens. But Tasunke had already seen all he needed to see. Calvin Brogan stood reloading his rifle with casual efficiency, while Sheriff Prater prepared to arrest or execute the only people who could expose their crimes. The posse members were growing restless, eager for the violence they had been promised. In that moment of analysis, the Lakota warrior made a decision that would determine whether justice or corruption triumphed in Copper Ridge, moving with the fluid grace that had kept him alive through years of conflict. Tasunke rolled backward away from the fire, his hand finding the knife at his belt as he came to his feet behind his horse. The animal, trained for war, immediately stepped sideways to provide cover while the warrior assessed his options. 8 mounted men with rifles against 4 warriors with knives and bows. Under normal circumstances, the odds would be hopeless. But these men were overconfident, drunk on their own perceived superiority, and unprepared for the reality of fighting trained warriors in terrain that favored stealth over firepower. The first shot came from Pete Morrison, and the gunsmith aimed at where Tasunke had been kneeling beside Ezra's body. The bullet struck empty air as the warrior melted into the shadows beyond the fire's reach. "Spread out!" Prater shouted, his voice cracking with sudden uncertainty as his easy victory began to slip away. "Don't let any of them escape." But the 4 Lakota had already vanished into the darkness with the silent efficiency of men whose lives depended on such skills. Years of being hunted had taught them every technique of concealment and evasion, lessons learned in blood during the endless conflicts with the U.S. Army. More shots rang out as the posse fired blindly into the night, their muzzle flashes destroying their vision and revealing their positions to the hidden warriors. Horses neighed and reared as the gunfire spooked them, adding chaos to the sheriff's carefully planned ambush. From the darkness came the whistle of arrows fired with deadly precision by men who had learned to hunt in silence. 2 of the posse members cried out as broadheads found their marks, not killing shots, but wounds that sent them tumbling from their saddles into the thorny underbrush. "They're picking us off," someone shouted in panic. "We need to get out of here." But Sheriff Prater had too much invested in this night's work to retreat now. "Hold your ground. They're just Indians. We got guns, and they got nothing but sticks and stones." His bravado might have convinced his men, if not for the scream that erupted from the darkness beyond the camp. One of the posse members had been separated from the group during the initial chaos, and whatever had happened to him in the shadows sounded neither quick nor merciful. That was enough for most of the remaining men. Despite Prater's cursing and threats, they began to withdraw toward town, leaving the sheriff, Calvin Brogan, and 2 diehard supporters alone in the hostile darkness. From concealment in the rocks above, Tasunke watched the retreat with grim satisfaction. The immediate threat had been neutralized, but at a terrible cost. Ezra was dead, and their evidence was in enemy hands, and time was running out for the child trapped in Brogan's shed. Worse, the confrontation had eliminated any possibility of legal resolution to the crisis. By morning, word would spread throughout the territory that savage Indians had murdered a respected businessman and a heroic old blacksmith. No judge, no matter how fair, would listen to their side of the story after such accusations. That left only one option: rescue Elsie themselves and flee to distant authorities with whatever evidence they could salvage from Ezra's forge. But first they had to survive the night. The pre-dawn hours found Tasunke alone in the ruins of his people's camp, gathering what supplies he could salvage from the scattered remnants of their belongings. Mahpia, Tatanka, and young Wanbli had scattered in different directions as planned drawing pursuit away from the main objective, while Tasunke prepared for the most dangerous mission of his life. The smell of smoke drifted from the direction of town, and orange flames flickered against the black sky. Someone, probably Calvin Brogan, in a fit of rage, had set fire to Ezra's blacksmith shop, destroying the forge that contained the hidden evidence of territorial corruption. With the documents burned and their only witness murdered, the conspiracy that had stolen Lakota lands and enabled decades of exploitation would remain safely buried. Judge Harrison might be honest and fair, but even he could not act without proof of criminal wrongdoing. That left only one witness who could testify to what she had seen, and suffered an 8-year-old girl locked in a wooden shed, scheduled to disappear forever in just a few hours. Tasunke checked his weapons one final time, his traditional knife, a tomahawk inherited from his father, and a bow with a quiver of arrows. Against the guns and numbers that would oppose him, they seemed pitifully inadequate. But they were tools he understood, completely extensions of his own body, honed by years of survival on the harsh frontier. More importantly, he possessed advantages his enemies lacked: intimate knowledge of the terrain around Copper Ridge, experience in stealth and infiltration gained during conflicts with the U.S. Army, and the desperate motivation of a man who had already lost everything he held dear. As the first pale light of dawn began to creep across the eastern horizon, he set out for town. The rescue had to succeed before Josiah Weeks loaded his wagon and departed for points unknown. If Elsie disappeared into the vast wilderness of the territories, she would never be found again, just another forgotten victim of frontier cruelty. But as Tasunke approached the outskirts of Copper Ridge, he discovered that his enemies had not been idle during the night hours. Roadblocks had been established at every approach to town, manned by armed citizens who had been convinced that bloodthirsty Indians planned to massacre every white person in the settlement. The story of the previous night's battle had grown in the telling, transforming a desperate fight for survival into an unprovoked, savage assault on civilized society. Women and children had been evacuated to the church basement, while every able-bodied man carried weapons and maintained constant vigilance. The atmosphere was that of a town under siege, with fear and hatred replacing rational thought in the minds of most residents. Sheriff Prater had used the crisis to expand his authority beyond all legal limits, declaring martial law and deputizing anyone willing to carry a badge. His new deputies included some of the territory's most violent men, drifters, failed miners, and professional killers who cared nothing for justice, but were eager for the bounty money being offered for dead Indians. $50 for each warrior, dead or alive. A fortune by frontier standards, enough to attract every man with a gun and a willingness to use it. Tasunke studied the defensive positions from concealment in the hills above town, looking for any weakness he could exploit. The boarding house sat near the center of the settlement, surrounded by open ground that would expose any approaching figure to devastating crossfire. But the shed where Elsie was imprisoned lay behind the main building, partially concealed by a cluster of outbuildings and storage structures. If he could reach that area without detection, he might be able to extract her before the alarm was raised. The challenge would be crossing 200 yards of open ground in broad daylight, without being spotted by dozens of armed and vigilant defenders. As he pondered, the seemingly impossible task, movement caught his eye near the boarding house. Josiah Weeks had emerged from the building and was checking the canvas cover on his wagon, preparing for departure. The peddler was a thin, nervous man in his 40s, with the pale complexion and soft hands of someone who avoided physical labor whenever possible. More concerning was the conversation between Weeks and Cyrus Brogan, which carried clearly in the morning air despite their attempt at discretion. "I don't like it." Weeks was saying, his voice high with anxiety. "All this Indian trouble, people getting killed, maybe we should wait a few days until things settle down." Brogan's response was sharp with irritation. "We had a deal, Weeks. $50 for the girl delivered today. I've got expenses to cover and debts to pay, and she's worth nothing to me if she dies of that fever." "What fever?" Weeks demanded, suddenly alert to the possibility that his merchandise might be damaged. "Nothing serious." Brogan lied smoothly. "Just a touch of heat sickness. She'll recover once she's out of that shed and getting proper food." But Tasunke could see the truth in Brogan's expression. And the man knew Elsie was dying and wanted to complete the sale before her death cost him the promised payment. The child's life had been reduced to a simple business transaction, her survival or death measured only in terms of monetary value. Time was running out for both the rescue and the girl it was meant to save. The solution came from an unexpected source, the town drunk. Mickey O'Halloran was a fixture in Copper Ridge's saloons, a former cavalry sergeant whose mind had been destroyed by too many battles and too much whiskey. Most citizens ignored him as a harmless nuisance, occasionally tossing him coins in exchange for entertaining stories of Indian fighting and frontier adventure. But Mickey retained enough military instinct to recognize the signs of an impending attack when he saw them. And his addled brain had fixated on the idea that hostile warriors were planning to infiltrate the town's defenses. "They're coming through the mine shafts," he announced loudly to anyone who would listen, weaving drunkenly between the defensive positions. "Saw their smoke signals last night. They're tunneling under the whole town. We need to flood the mines before they break through. Most people dismissed his ravings as alcohol-induced paranoia, but his words planted seeds of doubt in minds already strained by fear and sleeplessness. Several defenders began glancing nervously at the abandoned silver mine that lay just outside town limits, wondering if Mickey's theories might contain a grain of truth. Sheriff Prater seized on the opportunity to demonstrate his leadership. "Morrison, take 3 men and check those mine tunnels," he ordered. "Can't be too careful with these savages. They're cunning enough to try anything." Pete Morrison and his assigned partners reluctantly left their positions and headed toward the mine entrance, leaving a gap in the town's defensive perimeter. It was exactly the opening Tasunke had been waiting for. Moving with the fluid silence of a hunting cat, the Lakota warrior descended from his concealment and began working his way toward the boarding house through a series of ravines and dry washes. His dark clothing and natural camouflage skills made him nearly invisible against the desert landscape, while his knowledge of animal movement patterns allowed him to avoid the areas where sentries were most likely to spot motion. The journey that should have taken minutes stretched into an hour as he patiently worked from cover to cover, never moving when any defender might be looking in his direction. By the time he reached the cluster of outbuildings behind the boarding house, the sun had climbed well above the horizon, and Josiah Weeks was making final preparations for departure. The shed that imprisoned Elsie sat 20 yards from the main building, its wooden walls already beginning to radiate heat from the morning sun. No sound emerged from within, and for a terrible moment, Tasunke feared he might already be too late. Then he heard it, the faint whisper of labored breathing barely audible through the weathered planks. Working quickly but quietly, he examined the structure's construction for weaknesses. The door was secured with an iron hasp and padlock, but the rear wall consisted of loosely fitted boards that could be pried apart with careful effort. Using his knife, he began working one of the planks loose, creating a gap just wide enough for a small body to squeeze through. The work was agonizingly slow. Any sound might alert the guards who patrolled randomly around the property, but eventually he managed to create an opening. What he found inside nearly broke his heart. Elsie lay curled in the far corner unconscious and burning with fever. Her infected wounds had spread angry red streaks up both arms, and her breathing was shallow and irregular. The shed's interior was stifling hot and reeked of human waste, creating conditions that would kill a healthy adult, let alone a sick child. But she was alive, and that was enough. Gathering her carefully in his arms, Tasunke marveled at how light she had become. Malnutrition and illness had reduced her to little more than skin and bones, her small body radiating heat like a coal pulled from fire. "I'm here," he whispered in her ear, not knowing if she could hear him through the fever. "You're safe now. I'm taking you away from this place." As he lifted her through the opening he had created, Elsie's eyes fluttered open. For a moment, confusion clouded her fever-bright gaze. Then recognition dawned, and she managed a weak smile. "You came back," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I knew you would come back." The trust in her words nearly undid him, reminding him of another little girl who had believed her big brother would always protect her from harm. This time he vowed silently things would end differently. But even as he began carrying Elsie away from her prison, shouts erupted from the direction of the boarding house. "The shed's been broken open." Calvin Brogan's voice cracked with rage and disbelief. "The girl's gone. Someone's taken her." Within seconds, the entire town exploded into action. Bells began ringing the alarm, while armed men poured from buildings and defensive positions, all converging on the boarding house, where the impossible had apparently occurred. Sheriff Prater's roar of fury could be heard above all other sounds. "Find them $100 to the man who brings me that savage's scalp." The hunt was on, and Tasunke found himself trapped in the middle of a hostile settlement with a dying child in his arms, and enemies closing in from every direction. The chase that followed would be remembered in Copper Ridge as the day an entire town was outwitted by a single Indian warrior. Tasunke's years of survival on the frontier had taught him that sometimes the best hiding place was in plain sight. Instead of fleeing toward open country where mounted pursuers would run him down within minutes, he moved deeper into the town itself, using buildings and alleyways to break line of sight with his hunters. His first stop was the abandoned assay office at the edge of the commercial district, a single-room building that had been empty since the local silver mine played out 2 years earlier. Here, he took precious minutes to examine Elsie's condition more carefully and administer what treatment he could manage. The infection in her hands had progressed alarmingly, requiring immediate medical attention that he was not equipped to provide. Her fever approached dangerous levels, and her breathing had become increasingly labored. Without proper care, she would die within hours, regardless of whether they escaped their pursuers. But Copper Ridge's only doctor was firmly in Cyrus Brogan's camp, having been bought and paid for like most other officials in town. Approaching him for help would be tantamount to surrender. That left only one option: reach the Lakota camp, where traditional medicines and healing techniques might save her life. But the camp lay 15 miles across open desert, and every minute of delay reduced their chances of reaching safety. From the assay office, Tasunke moved to the abandoned church at the north end of town, carrying Elsie wrapped in his own shirt to protect her from the blazing sun. The building had been gutted by fire years earlier, leaving only stone walls and a partially collapsed roof that provided concealment from aerial observation. Here he paused to study the search patterns of his pursuers, looking for weaknesses he could exploit. Sheriff Prater had divided his men into 4 groups, each responsible for searching 1/4 of the town. They moved methodically from building to building, checking every possible hiding place with the thoroughness of experienced manhunters. But their very thoroughness worked against them. By concentrating on detailed searches of individual structures, they left gaps in their coverage that a careful observer could identify and exploit. More importantly, their focus on the town itself prevented them from considering other possibilities. None of the search parties had been dispatched to check the network of arroyos and dry washes that surrounded Copper Ridge drainage channels that could provide concealed routes away from the settlement. Tasunke began planning his escape route, identifying a path that would take him from the abandoned church to the edge of town without crossing the search grid his enemies had established. The route was dangerous and would require perfect timing, but it offered their best chance of breaking free from the net that was closing around them. As he prepared to move, Elsie stirred in his arms and opened her eyes. "Where are we?" she whispered weakly, looking around at the fire-blackened interior of the ruined church. "Somewhere safe for now," he replied quietly. "But we need to keep moving. Can you walk?" She tried to sit up but immediately collapsed back against his chest. "I don't think so. Everything hurts, and I feel so hot." Tasunke felt her forehead with the back of his hand, confirming what he already knew. Her fever was approaching the level where permanent damage became likely. Even if they escaped Copper Ridge successfully, she might not survive the journey to help. But surrender was not an option. He had seen what men like Brogan and Prater did to prisoners who possessed inconvenient knowledge. Elsie's testimony could expose decades of corruption and murder. They would never allow her to live long enough to speak to honest authorities. "Hold tight to me," he instructed her, wrapping her more securely in his shirt. "I'm going to carry you out of here, but you must be very quiet. Can you do that for me?" Despite her fever and weakness, Elsie managed a determined nod. "I won't make any noise, I promise." Her courage in the face of such overwhelming adversity reminded him powerfully of his lost sister, who had faced her own doom with similar dignity. The parallel gave him strength, even as it broke his heart, moving with infinite care. Tasunke emerged from the ruined church and began working his way toward the edge of town. Behind them, shouts and gunshots indicated that the search parties were growing increasingly frustrated with their failure to locate the fugitives. "Mubber, they can't have just vanished." Prater's voice echoed off the surrounding buildings. "Search every building again. Check the cellars, the attics, everywhere." But Tasunke was already beyond the reach of their systematic searches, moving through terrain they had dismissed as impassable. The dry wash that led away from Copper Ridge was barely 3 feet deep, but it provided sufficient concealment for a man who knew how to use every shadow and depression to his advantage. The greatest danger came not from human pursuit, but from the blazing sun and Elsie's deteriorating condition. As they moved away from town, her fever climbed higher and her breathing became more irregular. Several times she lost consciousness entirely, forcing him to stop and check for signs of life. By noon they had covered less than 5 miles, and Tasunke knew they were losing the race against time. The child in his arms was dying, and no amount of traditional healing could save her without immediate medical intervention. That was when he saw the dust cloud on the southern horizon. At first he feared it might be another pursuit party, but the movement pattern was wrong for mounted searchers. This was a single rider moving at high speed toward Copper Ridge, someone with urgent business in town. Using a spyglass taken from the abandoned church, Tasunke studied the approaching figure and felt his heart leap with sudden hope. The rider was a woman in her 30s, dressed in the practical clothing of a frontier doctor. Her saddlebags bulged with medical supplies, and her horse showed signs of hard travel over long distances. Most importantly, she rode alone and appeared to be approaching town from the direction of Tucson. Dr. Margaret Harrison. Judge Millard Harrison's daughter and one of the few physicians in the territory, with both the skill and integrity to treat patients regardless of their ability to pay or the color of their skin. Tasunke had heard stories of her work among the Apache reservations, where she had earned a reputation for fairness and competence that transcended racial boundaries. If anyone could save Elsie's life, while also ensuring her testimony reached honest authorities, it was the judge's daughter. But intercepting her would mean revealing his position to anyone watching from town, risking capture or death for both himself and the child he carried. Looking down at Elsie's flushed face, seeing the shadows under her eyes that spoke of approaching death, Tasunke made his decision. Some risks were worth taking. Dr. Margaret Harrison was tired, dusty, and looking forward to a hot meal and a soft bed when she saw the figure emerge from the desert scrubland beside the road to Copper Ridge. Her first instinct was to spur her horse and flee. A lone woman traveling the frontier faced dangers from desperate men of all descriptions, but something about the approaching stranger made her pause. He moved with the fluid grace of a natural horseman, his hands clearly visible and empty of weapons. More importantly, he carried what appeared to be a child in his arms, a small figure wrapped in cloth that suggested medical emergency rather than criminal intent. "Please," the man called out as he approached, his accented English carrying clearly in the desert air. "Are you a doctor? This child needs help badly." Margaret studied him more carefully as her horse pranced nervously beneath her. He was obviously Native American, probably Lakota based on his clothing and features, but his manners suggested desperation rather than hostility. The bundle in his arms moved weakly, confirming the presence of a living patient. "I am Dr. Harrison," she replied cautiously, her hand resting on the revolver at her belt. "What's wrong with the child?" "Infection and fever," Tasunke said urgently, unwrapping Elsie enough to show her flushed face and the angry red streaks on her arms. "She has been sick for days, and I cannot help her with what I have." Margaret had seen enough frontier medicine to recognize the signs of blood poisoning when they were presented to her. The child was critically ill and would die without immediate treatment, regardless of whatever circumstances had brought her into the care of a Lakota warrior. "Bring her here," she instructed, dismounting and opening her medical bag. "Lay her down carefully while I examine her." As Tasunke complied with her instructions, Margaret got her first clear look at the patient and felt her professional calm give way to shock. The child was obviously white, probably no more than 8 years old, and showed signs of systematic abuse and neglect that went far beyond her current medical crisis. How did she come to be in this condition? Margaret asked sharply, her suspicions about the warrior's motives beginning to shift toward a very different set of concerns. Tasunke hesitated, knowing that the truth would sound incredible to someone who had not witnessed the events firsthand. She was being held by a man in Copper Ridge, Cyrus Brogan. He starved her, beat her, forced her to work despite her sickness. The name struck Margaret like a physical blow. Cyrus Brogan, the boarding house owner. You know of him. Margaret's expression hardened as she began cleaning and treating Elsie's infected wounds. My father has been investigating reports of territorial corruption for months. Brogan's name appears in several complaints about illegal land seizures and missing persons, but we've never had witnesses willing to testify. As she worked, Tasunke quickly outlined the events of the past several days: Brogan's cruelty toward Elsie, the planned sale to Josiah Weeks, Ezra Milliken's murder, and the destruction of evidence, and the conspiracy of corruption that reached into the highest levels of territorial government. Margaret listened with growing amazement and horror, recognizing in the warrior's account the missing pieces of puzzles her father had been trying to solve for years. "The land surveys you mentioned," she said as she prepared an injection of antibiotics for Elsie's bloodstream. "Did you see them personally?" "Ezra showed them to me before he was killed. They proved that my people's exile was based on forged documents, criminal conspiracy to steal valuable mining land." "Those documents were burned." Tasunke nodded grimly. "Calvin Brogan set fire to the blacksmith shop last night. Everything was destroyed." Margaret finished administering the injection and began wrapping clean bandages around Elsie's hands and arms. The child's fever was beginning to respond to treatment, but she remained unconscious and dangerously weak. "There may be copies," she said thoughtfully. "My father has been corresponding with territorial surveyors about irregularities in land grants. If the original surveys were forged, there might be duplicate records in the territorial capital." Hope flickered in Tasunke's eyes for the first time since Ezra's death. Could such records be used as evidence? If they exist, yes. But first, we need to get this child to safety and medical care. Margaret stood and brushed dust from her skirts, her mind working through the complicated logistics of the situation. "I assume you're being pursued?" As if in answer to her question, the sound of distant gunshots echoed across the desert from the direction of Copper Ridge. The search parties had apparently discovered their escape route and were following their trail with renewed vigor. "They'll be here within the hour." Tasunke estimated, shading his eyes as he scanned the horizon for dust clouds. "Sheriff Prater has offered a $100 bounty for my scalp." Margaret made a decision that would have shocked anyone who knew her reputation for cautious professionalism. "Can you ride while holding her?" "If I must." "Then we're going to Tucson. My father needs to hear what you know, and this child needs hospital care." She began securing her medical supplies, while Tasunke gathered Elsie in his arms. "But first, we're going to stop by the telegraph office in Willow Creek." "For what purpose?" Margaret's smile was cold as desert wind. "To send word ahead that Judge Harrison will be convening a special territorial court session. It's time to dig up some buried secrets." As they mounted their horses and prepared to flee into the vast wilderness of the Arizona Territory, Tasunke felt something he had not experienced since his sister's death, and the possibility that justice might actually triumph over corruption. But behind them, the dust clouds were growing larger, and Sheriff Prater's posse was closing the gap with every passing minute. The race between justice and vengeance had only just begun. The telegraph office in Willow Creek was little more than a wooden shack beside the railroad tracks, manned by a nervous clerk, who looked up in alarm as three travel-stained figures burst through his door. Dr. Harrison's reputation preceded her even to this remote outpost. But the presence of a Lakota warrior, carrying an unconscious white child, raised questions the clerk was afraid to ask. "I need to send an urgent message to Judge Harrison in Tucson," Margaret announced without preamble, laying coins on the counter. "Official territorial business." The clerk, a thin young man named Peters, who had never dealt with anything more dramatic than cattle shipment schedules, fumbled for his message forms with shaking hands. "Yes, ma'am, Dr. Harrison. Right away." As Margaret dictated her telegram, Tasunke kept watch through the single window, his eyes scanning the eastern horizon for signs of pursuit. Elsie stirred occasionally in his arms, her fever breaking slightly thanks to the medicine Dr. Harrison had administered, but she remained weak and needed continued medical attention. The message Margaret composed was carefully worded to convey urgency without revealing too much information to potential eavesdroppers. Territorial corruption case requires immediate attention. Stop have critical witness and evidence. Stop request. Special court session. Stop arriving Tucson. Tomorrow stop. Send that immediately. She instructed Peters, then added a second message to the Territorial Surveyor's office, requesting copies of all land grant records for the Copper Ridge area dating back 5 years. The clerk worked his telegraph key with nervous efficiency, fully aware that he was handling communications far above his normal duties. The response from Tucson came within minutes. Court session approved. Stop federal marshals dispatched. Stop proceed with caution stop. But even as they prepared to leave Willow Creek, the sound of approaching hoofbeats announced that their head start was evaporating rapidly. How many? Margaret asked quietly, checking the loads in her revolver. Tasunke studied the dust cloud through the window. 8 riders, maybe 10, moving fast and coming straight here. The telegraph clerk overheard their conversation and went pale. Are you saying there's going to be shooting in my office? Not if we leave now. Margaret replied grimly. Peters, you never saw us. Understand? The young man nodded frantically, already composing the story he would tell when Sheriff Prater's posse arrived demanding information. Tasunke gathered Elsie more securely in his arms as they prepared to depart. The child's eyes fluttered open, and she looked up at him with growing awareness. Where are we now? She whispered, her voice still weak but clearer than it had been. Safe, he told her gently. This is Dr. Harrison. She's helping us get to people who can stop the bad men. Elsie turned her gaze to Margaret and managed a small smile. Are you really a doctor? A lady doctor? I am indeed. Margaret replied warmly, checking the child's pulse and finding it stronger than before. And you're going to be just fine. But we need to keep moving. They mounted their horses just as the first riders appeared on the eastern horizon, close enough now to distinguish individual figures. Sheriff Prater rode at the head of the group, his badge glinting in the afternoon sun, while Calvin Brogan flanked him with murder in his eyes. This way, Margaret called, spurring her horse toward a narrow trail that led into the foothills south of Willow Creek. There's an old mining road that connects to the main route to Tucson. If we can stay ahead of them for another hour. The chase that followed tested every skill Tasunke had learned during his years as a warrior and survivor. The mining road twisted through rocky canyons and along precipitous ledges that demanded careful navigation even under ideal circumstances. With a sick child in his arms and armed pursuers closing from behind every turn became a potential death trap. Margaret proved to be an excellent horsewoman, maintaining the punishing pace without complaint, while frequently checking on Elsie's condition. The antibiotics were taking effect, and the child's fever continued to drop, but the rough ride was taxing her limited strength. Behind them, Sheriff Prater's posse gained ground steadily. Their horses were fresh and unencumbered, while Tasunke's mount struggled under the double burden of rider and patient. Several times, rifle shots echoed through the canyons, as the pursuers tested the range, their bullets striking rocks uncomfortably close to their targets. There. Margaret pointed ahead to where the mining road intersected with the main route to Tucson. Once we reach that junction, we're only 30 miles from help. But as they approached the intersection, Tasunke spotted movement that made his heart sink. Another group of riders was approaching from the west, more of Prater's men positioned to cut off their escape route. Trap, he said, simply pulling his horse to a halt. Margaret quickly assessed their situation and came to the same grim conclusion. They were caught between 2 groups of armed men in terrain that offered little concealment. Fighting their way through was impossible while protecting Elsie, but surrender would mean death for all 3 of them. That was when the child in Tasunke's arms spoke up with surprising clarity. There's a cave. Elsie said weakly, pointing toward a barely visible opening in the canyon wall. I saw it when we came around that last bend. Big enough for horses, I think. Both adults stared at her in amazement. Despite her fever and exhaustion, the 8-year-old had been observing their route and looking for options her adult protectors had missed. The cave entrance was almost invisible, unless viewed from exactly the right angle, hidden behind a screen of desert brush and fallen rocks. It was barely large enough for a horse and rider, but it offered their only hope of avoiding the closing trap. Working together, they guided their mounts through the narrow opening and into a surprisingly spacious cavern that stretched back into the mountain. Fresh air flowing through unseen passages suggested other exits deeper in the cave system. Outside, the sound of hoofbeats grew louder as the two groups of pursuers converged on the intersection, their angry voices carrying clearly through the stone walls. Where the hell did they go? Calvin Brogan's voice cracked with frustration. They were right here a minute ago. Spread out and search every gully, Prater ordered. They can't have just vanished. Indians don't have magic no matter what the stories say. For the next hour, the fugitives huddled in darkness, while their enemies scoured the surrounding area. Several times, searchers passed within yards of the cave entrance, without detecting the hidden opening. Eventually, the sounds of the hunt moved away, as the posse expanded their search pattern to cover a wider area. But Margaret knew their respite was only temporary. They'll be back, she whispered, and next time they'll be more systematic. Tasunke nodded agreement, then surprised her by producing a small smile. Then we had better not be here when they return. Deep in the cave system, they had found what they were looking for. Another exit that opened onto a different canyon, one that led directly toward Tucson, without passing through any of the areas their pursuers were likely to search. As they prepared to continue their journey, Elsie reached up and touched Tasunke's face with one small bandaged hand. "Thank you," she said simply, "for not leaving me behind." The warrior's response was equally simple, but carried the weight of absolute conviction. Family does not abandon family. Behind them, the sounds of the frustrated search party faded into distance. Ahead lay Tucson Judge Harrison and the possibility of justice at last. But the hardest part of their journey was yet to come. Judge Millard Harrison had presided over territorial courts for 15 years, long enough to develop an instinct for recognizing truth amid the lies and half-truths that characterized frontier justice. The man who stood before his bench was clearly Native American, probably Lakota, and bore the weathered appearance of someone who had lived through considerable hardship. More intriguingly, he was accompanied by Dr. Margaret Harrison, the judge's own daughter, and a pale, thin child whose condition spoke of systematic abuse and neglect. Dr. Harrison. The judge began formally acknowledging their family relationship while maintaining professional distance. Your telegram suggested this case involved territorial corruption of some significance. Margaret stepped forward, her medical bag in one hand and a folder of documents in the other. "Father, this is Tasunke of the Lakota people, and this is Elsie Morrison, age 8. What they have to tell you will fundamentally change your understanding of how justice has been administered in Copper Ridge for the past decade." Over the next 2 hours, Judge Harrison listened with growing amazement and horror as the true story of Cyrus Brogan's criminal enterprise unfolded. Tasunke spoke with quiet dignity about his people's illegal exile, while Elsie, now clear-headed thanks to proper medical treatment, provided devastating testimony about the abuse she had suffered and witnessed. But the most damning evidence came from an unexpected source. The Territorial Surveyor's Office had responded to Margaret's telegraph with more than just duplicate records. A clerk named Wilson, troubled by irregularities he had noticed years earlier, had secretly maintained copies of suspicious documents in his personal files. "These are the original surveys," Judge Harrison said grimly, spreading the papers across his desk. "And these are the versions that were filed officially." The differences were stark and undeniable. Boundary lines moved, mineral rights reassigned, entire tribal territories erased with the stroke of a forger's pen. The conspiracy reaches all the way to the territorial capital. Margaret added, producing correspondence between various officials. Governor Patterson, Surveyor General Morrison, even some federal appointees were involved in the land fraud scheme. Tasunke leaned forward intently. Can this evidence convict them? Can it restore my people's land? Judge Harrison studied the documents carefully, his legal mind assessing their strength as evidence. It can do much more than that. This level of fraud constitutes grounds for federal intervention. I'm issuing warrants for the arrest of everyone involved, from Brogan and Sheriff Prater all the way up to the governor himself. But even as he spoke, a commotion in the outer office announced the arrival of unwelcome visitors. Sheriff Prater burst through the courtroom doors without ceremony, flanked by Calvin Brogan and 2 armed deputies. All 4 men were travel-stained and furious, their faces bearing the mark of men who had ridden hard in pursuit of their quarry. Mr. Judge Harrison. Prater announced with false officiality, I'm here to arrest these fugitives for murder, kidnapping, and conspiracy against the territorial government. The judge's expression remained calm despite the dramatic intrusion. Sheriff Prater, you are out of your jurisdiction and out of order. This is a federal court session, and I'll thank you to observe proper procedures. Procedures. Calvin Brogan laughed harshly. What procedures protect white children from being kidnapped by savages? What procedures punish Indians who murder respected citizens like Ezra Milliken? The procedures that require evidence and proper legal hearings. Harrison replied coolly. None of which you appear to possess. Prater's hand moved toward his gun. I got all the evidence I need right here. Dead blacksmith, missing child, and a bunch of hostile Indians who've been terrorizing honest folks. That was when Tasunke made his final crucial revelation. Tell them about Josiah Weeks, he said quietly to Elsie. The little girl looked up at Judge Harrison with absolute trust. Mr. Weeks buys children from Mr. Brogan. He was going to take me away in his wagon, but Tasunke saved me first. That's a lie, Calvin protested. My father runs a legitimate boarding house. He takes in orphans out of Christian charity. Judge Harrison turned to his daughter. Margaret, what was this child's medical condition when you first examined her? Dr. Harrison's professional testimony was precise and damning. Severe malnutrition, untreated infected wounds, signs of systematic physical abuse extending over several years. Without immediate treatment, she would have died within hours. The judge's gaze shifted to Sheriff Prater. This is your definition of Christian charity, Sheriff. Before Prater could respond, another figure entered the courtroom, U.S. Marshal James Crawford, a lean, hard-eyed man in his 40s who carried federal authority like a weapon. Judge Harrison, Crawford announced formally, I have warrants for the arrest of Daniel Prater, Calvin Brogan, and several other individuals on charges of conspiracy, fraud, and murder. The federal marshal's arrival changed everything. Suddenly, Prater and Calvin found themselves facing arrest rather than making arrests, while the evidence against them mounted with each passing minute. But the greatest shock was yet to come. Where? There's something else. Marshal Crawford continued, producing a leather satchel from his saddlebags. We intercepted Josiah Weeks attempting to cross into Mexico with a wagon full of children. He's agreed to testify against the entire child trafficking operation in exchange for a reduced sentence. Calvin Brogan's face went white. That's impossible. Weeks would never... Never what? Crawford asked mildly. Never admit to buying kidnapped children for sexual slavery. Never describe how your father supplied him with orphans and runaways. Never detail the entire criminal enterprise that's been operating for years. The young man's protests died in his throat as the full scope of his legal predicament became clear. Judge Harrison gathered the evidence spread across his desk and addressed the courtroom with formal solemnity. Based on the testimony and evidence presented, I am issuing the following orders. First, all land seizures based on the fraudulent surveys are hereby declared null and void. Second, full restitution will be made to the Lakota people for their illegally confiscated territories. Third, federal charges will be filed against all individuals involved in this conspiracy. He turned to Tasunke with something approaching respect in his eyes. The courage you showed in rescuing this child and bringing this evidence to light has exposed one of the most extensive criminal conspiracies in territorial history. Justice has been served because you refused to let injustice stand. But even as the judge spoke, Tasunke's attention was focused on the small hand that slipped into his own. Elsie looked up at him with eyes that held no trace of the fear and despair he had first seen in them. "What happens to me now?" she asked quietly. Judge Harrison answered before anyone else could speak. "You'll be placed with a good family here in Tucson. The Andersons run the territorial orphanage, and they've specifically requested to care for children who have suffered as you have. Will I see Tasunke again?" The question hung in the air, like a prayer carrying all the weight of a child's desperate need for continuity in a world that had shown her nothing but cruelty. Tasunke knelt to her level, his weathered hands gentle as they framed her small face. "The bonds between family are not broken by distance," he told her seriously. "When the meadowlarks sing in the morning, remember that your brother is thinking of you." As he pressed a small carved bird into her palm, a meadowlark carved from white pine, Elsie smiled for the first time since her parents' death. "I'll listen for them every day," she promised. 6 months later, Tasunke stood on the ridge above his people's restored homeland, watching children play in the valley below. The buffalo were few now, and the old ways would never fully return, but they had their land back, and with it, their dignity. In his pocket, he carried a letter written in a child's careful script. "Dear brother, I heard meadowlarks singing this morning and thought of you. Mrs. Anderson says I can write to you whenever I want. I'm learning to read and do numbers, and I help take care of the smaller children. Thank you for showing me that not all the world is cruel." The wind carried the scent of sage and rain across the valley, and somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark called out its liquid song. Tasunke closed his eyes and listened, remembering a little girl's tears and an old man's courage, and the strange paths that led to justice in a harsh and beautiful world. Behind him, his people built their fires and prepared for the evening meal, their voices carrying stories of survival and hope into the gathering dusk. The circle was complete, the debts were paid, and the future stretched ahead like an uncharted trail full of possibility and light.